Imagine walking through the center of an American city in 1920. You don't hear a constant roar of engines, but an intermittent electric hum, metal bells, and the hiss of brakes on rail. Streetcars pass like the bloodstream of the place. They connect neighborhoods, factories, schools, theaters, and stations. People don't go for a drive. They simply step out, hop on, drop a coin, and the city opens up in front of them. In that world, the streetcar isn't a curiosity, it's the backbone. In hundreds of cities and towns, electric lines hold up daily life, work schedules, neighborhood expansion, and even land prices revolve around where the rails run. The automobile exists, yes, but it hasn't taken control yet. The future looks like it's being written in electricity. And yet, within a few decades, that system nearly disappears. Rails are ripped up, wires come down, depots are emptied. In their place arrive buses, highways, parking lots, and a new way of life, where getting around no longer depends on a shared network, but on a private vehicle. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't simple modernization. It was a complete transformation of how a society is designed. This is the story of how the United States had electric streetcars in almost every city, and then eliminated them. Before starting this video, remember to subscribe and like it. In 1920, for most urban Americans, the streetcar was the center of gravity of everyday life. It wasn't a luxury or an attraction. It was the normal way to get to work, take children to school, cross town to shop, or go out at night without depending on anyone. The streetcar set the rhythm. It arrived every few minutes, stopped at familiar points, and followed a stable route. That stability was power. Electricity turned the old slow horse cars into a machine of routine. With an electric motor and overhead power, a streetcar could accelerate smoothly, climb grades more safely, and move more passengers per hour than almost any street-level alternative of the time. With no highways and streets still built for pedestrians, carts and bicycles, rails offered an advantage. They reduced the sway of traffic and provided a physical guide. Where there was rail, there was direction. That guide shaped the city. Many streetcar companies built new lines not only to sell fares, but to push growth into areas where they also had real estate interests. They opened a corridor, land values rose, shops appeared, then homes, and finally an entire neighborhood consolidated around access to the streetcar. The city expanded, yes, but it expanded in arms connected to the center, not as an endless stain. People could live farther away and still arrive because the streetcar carried the distance. And yet, that same system had a dangerous crack. It was expensive to maintain and hard to adapt. The rails didn't move. The wires couldn't be relocated easily. Every repair demanded construction work, time, and money. At the same time, in many cities, fares were locked into agreements and regulations that kept them artificially low. For passengers, it was a blessing. You paid the same even as everything around you got more expensive. For companies, it was a padlock. In the 1920s, that tension still looked like a management problem, not an existential threat. Streetcars were still packed, cities were still growing, and the automobile wasn't yet an overwhelming force. But the future of the streetcar didn't depend only on technology. It depended on something quieter. Who would pay for the city being built, and who would profit from changing the model? And that battle, even if no one called it that, had already begun. The breaking point came when the streetcar stopped competing only against other modes of transport and started competing against an idea: the automobile as personal freedom. In the 1920s, cars began to multiply, and with them, the way people imagined mobility changed. It was no longer getting onto a shared network. It was leaving whenever you wanted, going wherever you wanted, without waiting for schedules. But that dream came with an enormous cost, and someone had to pay it. A streetcar concentrates passengers. A car scatters trips. For the automobile to work as the dominant mode, you need wider streets, stronger pavement, traffic lights, signage, bridges, parking. A city designed for streetcars can operate with defined corridors and density. A city designed for cars needs space, and lots of it. The result was that the street itself began to change owners. Where the streetcar once had natural priority because of its fixed route, car traffic became the new normal. Delays grew. A streetcar trapped behind cars loses its advantage. It stops being fast and becomes a rigid vehicle that can't escape chaos. Every extra minute worsens the passenger experience and increases operating costs. And those costs again collided with frozen fares. Then the Great Depression hit. With the economy battered, streetcar companies found themselves in a perfect trap. Fewer riders, less revenue, more pressure not to raise fares, and a physical system that still demanded maintenance no matter what. Rails wear out even with fewer people. Wires sag even if the neighborhood is poorer. Old cars need parts even if the cash box is empty. In many cities, companies were weakened precisely when transportation became more essential than ever. At the same time, an alternative solidified that looked more flexible: the bus. It didn't need rails. It didn't need wires. It could detour, change routes, serve new zones without heavy public works. And above all, it could be marketed as modern and efficient against a streetcar that, by the sheer visibility of its infrastructure, was starting to be treated as a relic. The irony is cruel. The electric streetcar was technologically elegant, but its infrastructure was so visible that it became a cultural target. At that moment, a narrative was born that would prove decisive. Streetcars were obstacles to progress. They clogged traffic. They were old. They represented a city of the past. What wasn't said as loudly was that many of their weaknesses weren't technical. They were political and economic. A system can be good and still lose if the environment is redesigned to make it look bad. As war approached and then erupted, the United States entered a mobilization economy. And here a paradox appears. During World War II, urban public transportation, including streetcars, experienced a massive resurgence. Gasoline and rubber were rationed. New car production was halted. Millions of workers moved to factories and shipyards. Cities needed huge transport capacity, and the streetcar was there, ready, already installed. In those years, streetcars proved their worth with an almost uncomfortable clarity. They moved crowds, withstood demand, and because they were electric, they didn't rely on liquid fuel in the same way. It was living proof that the model could support a nation under extreme pressure. If the story ended there, the streetcar would have won. But the war also changed something else. It created enormous industrial capacity and a culture of mass production that, once the conflict ended, needed a new destination. The factories that had produced engines, tires, steel, and components for war could now feed a vast civilian market. And the perfect civilian product to absorb that machine was the automobile. The country had money, it had industry, and it had an idea already planted, that modernity was measured in cars. On top of that, the state invested as never before in road infrastructure, roads, highways, and later interstate systems. That investment was a signal. The future would be built on asphalt. In that world, the streetcar began to look like a network that required specialized care and municipal coordination, while the automobile seemed to be solved by building more roads. Here is a crucial piece. Many streetcar companies were private and heavily regulated. They had service obligations, fixed routes, and maintenance responsibilities. When the time came to modernize fleets and renew aging rails, the investment was enormous. And for a private company with limited fares, that expense was a mountain. By contrast, the bus model was sold as a quick exit. Buy a fleet, remove the rails, free the street, and transportation stays on wheels, adaptable and seemingly cheaper. In many cities, the process took on a tone of inevitability. People talked about retiring the old to make room for the new. But behind that word, inevitable, was a decision. Someone chose not to reinvest in the electric rail system. Someone chose dismantling over modernization. And in that period, purchases, mergers, and ownership changes also appeared that accelerated the conversion to buses across multiple urban networks. The result was that the streetcar, essential even in wartime, entered peacetime, weakened, aging, and culturally attacked. The elimination of the streetcar didn't happen overnight. It was a cascade. First, upgrades stopped. Then maintenance was postponed. After that, failures became more frequent. Service deteriorated, people got frustrated, and the argument reinforced itself. It doesn't work anymore. It's the perfect cycle for justifying a shutdown. When a system is degraded through neglect, its collapse looks natural. In parallel, the automobile consumed urban space. Parking lots appeared where shops used to be. Buildings were demolished to widen avenues. Intersections were redesigned for car flow, not pedestrians. And when the street is reorganized for the car, any fixed streetcar network is at a disadvantage. It crosses lanes, interrupts turns, demands priority. So the streetcar was framed as an obstacle, even though the real cause was that the owner of the street had changed. The bus, meanwhile, was politically convenient. It looked flexible, quick to deploy, and it didn't leave visible scars like rails and wires. If a route didn't work, it could be changed. If a neighborhood grew, the line could be extended. And in the public narrative, the bus aligned with the modernity of asphalt. But that flexibility carried a hidden price. It depended on fuel. It competed for the same space as cars, and its capacity per unit of street was lower than a well-run streetcar or light rail. In other words, it solved the short term, but it could worsen the long term. Meanwhile, suburban growth exploded. Homes farther out, bigger lots, curving streets, isolated shopping centers. That urban pattern was almost incompatible with a traditional streetcar network. Streetcars favor dense corridors. Dispersed suburbs favor the car. And when the environment becomes dispersed, public transit loses efficiency, which reinforces car dependence. The city becomes a vicious circle. It expands for cars, then it needs cars, then it expands even more for cars. Many streetcar systems were literally ripped out. Rails were paved over or removed. Wires came down. Depots were sold. And with every kilometre dismantled, something more than transportation was lost. Urban memory. Neighbourhoods that had been born around the streetcar adapted as best they could. But the logic of access changed, from walking to a stop to needing a car or a bus stuck in traffic. In that process, the country didn't just replace one vehicle with another. It replaced one idea of the city with another. The streetcar city was a city of proximity. The automobile city was a city of distance. And when you choose distance, you also choose a world where mobility stops being a shared service and becomes private property. Today, when people talk about mobility and look back, the 1920 streetcar no longer feels outdated. It feels ahead of its time. Not because it was perfect, but because it represented an urban logic that was more energy efficient and more human in scale. A fixed electric system can be a limitation, yes, but it's also a promise. If the route exists, the service doesn't vanish on a whim. Fixed infrastructure forces planning, and planning forces you to think about the common good. The elimination of the streetcar reveals an uncomfortable truth. Technologies don't die only because they are bad. They die when the world stops being designed for them. The streetcar lost because the street was redesigned for the automobile, because the economy reorganized around fuel, because culture turned mobility into personal identity, and because many networks were trapped in financial models and regulations that suffocated them precisely when reinvestment was needed. And yet, the story has an ironic twist. Decades later, many cities began rebuilding something similar: light rail, modern streetcars, electric corridors. Not out of nostalgia, but as a response to problems created by the dominant model: congestion, pollution, car dependence, unequal access. It's as if the country once had an answer, dismantled it, and then spent generations paying the cost of rebuilding it. The lesson isn't that the streetcar was magical or that the automobile is the only villain. The lesson is that infrastructure decisions turn into destiny. A rail laid down defines decades of development. A rail torn out does too. When a city chooses a system, it chooses what kinds of life it makes easy and what kinds of life it makes expensive. That's why this story isn't only about wires and wheels. It's about how a country changed the way its citizens move, shop, live, and dream. In 1920, the future looked electric and shared. In 1950, the future looked private and motorized. And today, the future looks back again, with a mix of nostalgia and urgency, at that network that was once almost everywhere. The streetcar didn't disappear because it didn't work. It disappeared because the country decided the city should adapt to the car, not the other way around. And once you make that choice, you don't just change transportation, you change society itself. The history of electric streetcars in the United States isn't a story of lost technology, but of shifted priorities. In 1920, rails and wires held up urban life with a normalcy so solid it felt permanent. But nothing is permanent when public space is redistributed, when investment changes direction, and when an entire culture starts confusing mobility with ownership. Streetcars didn't leave on their own. They were replaced, dismantled, and in many cases deliberately forgotten, so the new city could feel inevitable. And maybe the most unsettling question is this. If a nation could dismantle an urban electric network that widespread in just a few decades, what other collective decisions are we making today that will seem irreversible until someone questions them again? Because in the end, the streetcar wasn't only a vehicle. It was an idea of the city. And when that idea disappeared, what changed wasn't just the sound in the street. It was the life the street made possible. As always, if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and leave your like. See you in the next video.